On a frost-covered Sunday morning in November 1958, Reverend Thomas Mitchell stood at the pulpit of Grace Community Church in Millbrook, Indiana, population 4,200, and looked out over the 67 faces gathered for worship, never imagining that one of them had spent the last 5 years living a meticulously crafted lie. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows, depicting scenes from the New Testament, casting patterns of crimson and gold across the worn wooden pews where families had sat for generations. The congregation believed they knew each other's stories, their struggles, their deepest convictions, bound together by faith and the comfort of small-town familiarity, where everyone recognized everyone else's car, where secrets seemed impossible to keep, where the rhythms of life moved with predictable, reassuring constancy. They were catastrophically wrong. What would unfold over the next 18 months would shatter that illusion completely and reveal how the Cold War's invisible battles could reach into the most unlikely corners of America, transforming a simple man of faith into an unlikely guardian against one of the Soviet Union's most audacious espionage operations. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Thomas Mitchell had never wanted to be a detective or any kind of investigator. At 42 years old, with graying temples and reading glasses that perpetually slid down his nose during sermon preparation, he had devoted his entire adult life to ministry, first as a young pastor fresh from seminary in rural Ohio, where he had learned the unglamorous realities of church work, then for the past 12 years at Grace Community Church, where he had married couples, baptized their children, and eventually presided over their funerals. His days followed predictable, comforting rhythms that changed with the seasons, but never in their essential character. Preparing sermons at his oak desk inherited from the church's founding pastor, visiting the sick and elderly who comprised an ever-growing portion of his responsibilities as the congregation aged, counseling troubled marriages with patience born of understanding human weakness, organizing church suppers where the women of the congregation competed with fierce but friendly rivalry over who made the best green bean casserole, peach cobbler, or 7-layer salad. The parsonage where he lived with his wife Eleanor and their 3 children sat adjacent to the church building, separated by perhaps 50 feet of lawn that Mitchell himself mowed every Saturday morning during the growing season. A modest white clapboard structure that had housed 7 generations of pastors before him, its walls thin enough that the family could hear the church bells when they rang for weddings or funerals. Millbrook itself seemed frozen in an earlier, simpler time, as if the complexities of the modern world simply stopped at the town limits. Main Street stretched for 8 blocks of brick buildings constructed in the 1890s, lined with locally owned shops whose proprietors knew their customers by name and extended credit based on handshakes rather than paperwork. A single movie theater called the Regal that showed films 3 months after their big city releases to audiences who did not seem to mind the delay. And Harold's Diner, where farmers gathered each morning at 5:30 for coffee, served in thick ceramic mugs and complaints about weather and crop prices that never changed much from year to year. The town had one high school, whose basketball team the entire community followed with passionate intensity. 2 traffic lights installed over protests from residents who insisted they were unnecessary, and a shared conviction among its inhabitants that nothing truly important or dangerous ever happened within its borders, that the dramatic events reported in newspapers and on the nightly television news occurred in distant places that might as well be on other planets for all the impact they had on daily life in Millbrook. That widespread conviction and the resulting lack of vigilance made it absolutely perfect for what the Soviets had in mind when they selected it as a placement location. The story truly began not in Millbrook, but thousands of miles away in Vinnytsia, Ukraine, a city that few Americans had ever heard of, where the KGB maintained one of its most secretive and sophisticated training facilities designed specifically for the illegals program. There, hidden behind high walls and guard towers, in a meticulously constructed replica of American suburbia that had been built with almost obsessive attention to detail, complete with ranch-style houses featuring attached garages and manicured lawns, drugstores stocked with authentic American products, a mock post office, and even a functioning church with a steeple and hymnals printed in English. Soviet intelligence officers spent years learning to become someone else entirely, to shed their Russian identities as completely as a snake sheds its skin. They studied American colloquialisms and regional speech patterns with linguists who had lived for years in various parts of the United States, practiced ordering meals at diners and discussing sports with the casual fluency of natives, memorized baseball statistics and the plots of popular television shows, learned to drive American cars with their automatic transmissions and bench seats, absorbed the intricate social rituals and unspoken rules of small-town Protestant church life, where people judged you not just by what you said but by how you said it, when you arrived, where you sat, and 1,000 other subtle signals that marked insiders from outsiders. The Illegals program, as it was known within the highest levels of the KGB, represented one of the Soviet Union's most ambitious and expensive espionage operations, begun in the 1920s and continuing through the Cold War. The systematic placement of deep-cover agents in American communities where they would live for years, sometimes entire decades, building authentic-seeming lives while waiting to be activated for specific intelligence-gathering missions that might never come, but for which they had to remain perpetually prepared. Among these illegals, carefully selected from thousands of candidates, was a man whom the Soviets had christened Peter Volkov after months of deliberation, about which American name would be both unremarkable and regionally appropriate. Born in Leningrad in 1923 to a family of minor Communist Party officials who saw his recruitment as the highest honor, he had shown exceptional aptitude for languages from childhood, speaking German and English by age 14, and possessed an almost chameleon-like ability to observe others and adapt his personality, mannerisms, and speech patterns to mirror whatever situation he found himself in, a talent that his handlers recognized as extraordinarily rare and valuable. After recruitment at age 28, approached in a carefully staged encounter that made him feel chosen for something important, he spent the next 4 years being systematically transformed through a process so thorough that it resembled a kind of psychological death and rebirth. His accent was scrubbed away syllable by linguists who had lived in Chicago, Detroit, and other Midwestern cities, and who made him repeat phrases 10,000 times until every trace of Russian pronunciation disappeared. He memorized the intricate details of a completely fabricated life story that he would need to maintain with perfect consistency for the rest of his operational career. Supposedly born in Chicago on March 7, 1923, father named William Henderson, who worked as a factory foreman, mother named Margaret Henderson, maiden name Sullivan, who worked as a seamstress, both tragically killed in a car accident on the South Side in 1946, when their vehicle was struck by a drunk driver. No siblings, no close relatives, a childhood of modest circumstances, attendance at a Catholic elementary school, followed by a public high school, from which he graduated in 1941. A brief period of factory work before being drafted into the army in 1943, where he served as a supply clerk and saw no combat. Honorable discharge in 1946, then a series of unremarkable jobs drifting through the Midwest. He learned to throw and catch a baseball with reasonable competence, developed a casual appreciation for jazz music and big band sounds, memorized the basic tenets of Catholic and Protestant theology so he could discuss them naturally, and practiced expressing casual disdain for communist ideology with the weary cynicism of someone who had heard too much propaganda and just wanted to live his life in peace. By the time he arrived in New York, aboard a merchant vessel in November 1953, carrying forged documents of extraordinary quality, identifying him as Peter Henderson, age 30, with a complete paper trail that would withstand all but the most intensive investigation, he had become his cover identity so completely that even he sometimes forgot in unguarded moments where the lie ended and any authentic self, if such a thing still existed, began. Peter Henderson, as he was now exclusively and irrevocably known, spent his first year in America working a series of low-level jobs in Philadelphia, deliberately living on the economic and social margins, establishing his false identity through the accumulated weight of countless small interactions that would create a paper trail and personal history. obtaining a Social Security card by presenting his forged documents at the Philadelphia office, getting a Pennsylvania driver's license after passing the test on his second attempt with deliberate mediocrity, filing tax returns with modest income that raised no suspicion, making casual friendships with co-workers at a warehouse where he worked for 8 months who would later, if ever asked, remember him as a quiet, reliable guy who kept to himself but was always willing to help load trucks or cover an extra shift. In early 1954, following complex instructions received through a sophisticated system of coded messages hidden in the classified advertising sections of major newspapers that he checked religiously every Sunday morning, he relocated to Millbrook, following the death of its previous hardware store assistant manager, a carefully researched opening that his handlers had identified as perfect for their purposes, and took a position working for widower Frank Henderson, no biological relation despite the convenient shared surname that had been one factor in his placement there, who was 68 years old and delighted to finally have reliable help after 3 years of struggling to manage the store alone following his son's death in the Korean War. Peter Henderson was exactly the kind of person that Millbrook appreciated without quite noticing, quiet without being suspicious, hard-working without being ambitious, polite but not intrusive, helpful without being pushy. He rented a small apartment above the hardware store, consisting of a bedroom, tiny kitchen and bathroom, furnished with second-hand pieces that he purchased from families who were replacing old items, joined the Lions Club after being invited by Frank Henderson, who was a long-time member, volunteered for the annual 4th of July celebration committee, where his organizational skills and willingness to do unglamorous work, like setting up folding chairs, won appreciation, attended high school basketball games where he clapped at appropriate moments, but never displayed the fanatical enthusiasm of natives, and gradually wove himself into the fabric of the community with such patient skill that within 2 years people struggled to remember when he had not been part of Millbrook. And on his 3rd Sunday in town, responding to what he portrayed as a sincere desire to reconnect with faith after years of drifting, he walked through the heavy oak doors of Grace Community Church, where Reverend Mitchell welcomed him with a warm handshake and an invitation to the fellowship hour after the service, where women from the congregation served coffee and homemade cookies, while members mingled and newcomers were introduced around with friendly curiosity. Reverend Mitchell noticed nothing unusual or concerning about this new arrival that cold Sunday morning. Peter Henderson seemed like dozens of other single men who had drifted into Millbrook over the years, looking for honest work and perhaps a fresh start after difficulties elsewhere that they preferred not to discuss in detail. He was reserved in a way that suggested past pain rather than anything sinister, always ready with a sincere compliment about the sermon that demonstrated he had actually listened rather than just sitting politely, though he rarely offered personal details about his supposed past, beyond the basic outline of a difficult childhood, limited education, and tragic family loss that had left him entirely alone in the world. When pressed by the inevitable curiosity of parishioners, particularly the older women who felt it their mission to know everything about everyone, he would change the subject with practiced ease that never seemed evasive, asking thoughtful questions about others, rather than answering questions about himself, expressing interest in their lives, their families, their concerns in ways that felt genuine and made people feel heard and valued, which naturally made them like him more and question him less. What made Peter Henderson particularly valuable to Soviet intelligence was not dramatic spycraft involving secret meetings in shadowy locations or dangerous missions stealing military secrets. His role, carefully explained during his final briefings before deployment, was far more mundane but equally crucial to the overall intelligence network. He was what the KGB internally designated as a support agent or dormant operative. His job was to maintain a stable, completely invisible presence in Middle America, someone who could provide safe houses for other operatives passing through the Midwest on more active missions, who could receive and forward communications using various methods, including coded newspaper advertisements and dead drops, who could monitor local news and report quarterly on anything of potential intelligence value. Nearby military installations like the Naval Air Station, located 90 miles south, defense contractors like the machine tool manufacturer 40 miles east, that produced components for military aircraft, local politicians who might be vulnerable to blackmail or ideological recruitment, National Guard armory locations, infrastructure that could be sabotaged in the event of war. Millbrook itself held no particular strategic importance and appeared nowhere in Soviet planning documents as a priority target, but its location made it ideal, positioned between Indianapolis and Fort Wayne, along highways connecting multiple mid-sized cities, close enough to interesting targets, but far enough from major counterintelligence operations to minimize risk, and its very ordinariness. Its complete lack of anything remarkable made it essentially invisible to anyone looking for Soviet activity, making it perfect for covert operations that required absolutely no scrutiny or suspicion. He was a carefully placed piece on a vast chessboard, positioned not for immediate use but for potential future need, and his greatest contribution to Soviet intelligence was simply being there, reliably year after year, building a life that could never be questioned. For nearly 5 years, Peter Henderson played his assigned role with such flawless execution that his KGB handlers used recordings of his periodic reports as training materials for other illegals. He became a fixture in Millbrook's landscape, someone people greeted on the street with a wave and a smile without really thinking about him as an individual, which was precisely and exactly the point of his entire operation. He attended church every Sunday morning, sitting in the same pew, participated in men's fellowship breakfasts where he listened more than he spoke, helped paint the church basement one summer weekend, dated occasionally but never seriously, always ending relationships before they became serious enough to require deep personal disclosure, carefully selecting women who themselves preferred casual companionship over intense commitment. He attended every service with consistent devotion, but never joined the church governing board, despite multiple invitations, or volunteered for leadership positions that would increase scrutiny, maintaining the absolutely perfect balance between visible involvement that demonstrated community membership and an almost invisible presence that left no memorable impression beyond general pleasantness. Then came the winter of 1958, and a series of small anomalies that would eventually unravel 5 years of perfect tradecraft. It started with a moment so trivial that Reverend Mitchell almost dismissed it immediately as his imagination or meaningless coincidence. During a Wednesday evening Bible study session in early November, 12 members gathered in the church basement while a cold rain drummed against high windows. The group was discussing the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5 through 7, passages Mitchell had preached on countless times. Peter Henderson, sitting in a metal folding chair and holding a worn Bible he had purchased at a used bookstore, offered a thoughtful comment about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And as he spoke about the passage regarding laying up treasures in heaven, the Reverend noticed something subtly odd in his phrasing, something he could not immediately identify. Henderson referenced a verse using a slightly unusual translation, saying the passage spoke of treasures being consumed by moths rather than eaten or destroyed, and the specific word choice struck Mitchell as familiar, but not in the right way, triggering a memory from his seminary days of studying translation variations between American and European editions of Scripture. Something about how certain English translations produced for overseas markets used different vocabulary choices that reflected British rather than American English patterns, or were influenced by translations into other European languages before being rendered into English. It was the kind of extraordinarily subtle detail that 99.9% of listeners would never notice or think twice about. But Mitchell had spent years at seminary studying textual variations and translation differences, writing papers comparing various versions, and his ear was trained to catch these minute discrepancies the way a music teacher hears a note played slightly flat that no one else notices. The observation flickered through his conscious mind like a dim star glimpsed at the corner of vision, and disappeared before he could focus on it, not rising to the level of conscious concern or sustained attention, just a momentary curiosity quickly displaced by other thoughts. But 3 weeks later, during the church's annual Thanksgiving potluck dinner, where long tables covered in white paper groaned under casseroles, roasted turkeys, and pies of every description, Henderson brought a large covered dish he described warmly as a family recipe for chicken stew that his mother used to make when he was growing up, one of the few happy food memories from his childhood. Eleanor Mitchell, who prided herself on her extensive knowledge of regional American cuisine, accumulated from decades of church suppers, county fairs, and her own mother's encyclopedic recipe collection, served herself a generous portion and tasted it with the appreciative expression of someone encountering good home cooking, but then paused, taking another smaller bite with more analytical attention, and later that evening quietly commented to her husband that the spice combination was unusual in an interesting way, noting that it used paprika and what tasted like caraway seeds in proportions that seemed almost Eastern European in character, perhaps Hungarian or Polish, certainly not typical of the Anglo-German Midwestern cooking that dominated church suppers where black pepper was considered adventurous seasoning. Again, a tiny detail, easily explained by countless innocent reasons. Perhaps Henderson had worked with immigrants at some point and learned different cooking traditions. Perhaps he simply enjoyed experimenting with spices. Perhaps his memory of his mother's cooking was imperfect, and he had inadvertently altered the recipe over years of making it himself. The small incidents continued to accumulate slowly through December and into the new year of 1959, like snow gathering on a roof, individually insignificant but collectively becoming a weight. At a January Lions Club meeting held at the VFW Hall, where members gathered monthly to plan community service projects, someone made a casual joke about the terrible performance of the Chicago White Sox during the previous baseball season, and Henderson's response, though appropriate and garnering laughs, revealed a knowledge of statistics and player names that seemed strangely learned and factual rather than emotionally lived, like someone who had memorized baseball encyclopedias but never actually spent childhood summers listening to games on the radio with their father, never felt the crushing disappointment of a losing season in their bones, never developed the irrational, passionate attachment that American boys absorb through cultural osmosis. He knew which players had which batting averages and could discuss trades and statistics, but he seemed to completely lack the emotional investment that Americans typically brought to discussing their supposed favorite teams, treating it more like an academic subject than a visceral part of identity. During a conversation about music at a church fellowship event in February, Henderson expressed genuine and knowledgeable appreciation for classical composers, discussing Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff with an enthusiasm and depth of knowledge that seemed slightly disproportionate compared to his notably lukewarm and generic response when someone mentioned Elvis Presley, whose performance on The Ed Sullivan Show had scandalized and thrilled the nation, or when another church member brought up Buddy Holly, who remained hugely popular despite his tragic death the previous year. Henderson offered only the kind of vague, pleasant agreement that suggested he was aware these were important cultural figures but had no personal connection to their music or cultural impact. Individually, none of these moments meant anything significant or rose to the level of actual evidence of wrongdoing. Each could be explained by personality differences, diverse background, personal preferences, and the natural variation in how people engage with culture. Collectively, though, they created a pattern, a subtle discontinuity that Mitchell's subconscious mind was processing and cataloging even before his conscious awareness acknowledged any particular concern or suspicion. The Reverend was emphatically not naturally suspicious by temperament or philosophy. His entire worldview, carefully constructed over decades of ministry and reading theology, was built on fundamental trust, on believing the best about people, unless proven otherwise, on accepting them at face value and offering grace for imperfections, on the core conviction that people were generally honest and that suspicion and paranoia were corrosive forces that destroyed communities. But he also possessed something that would prove crucial in the coming months, an exceptionally good memory for details that bordered on photographic, particularly regarding conversations and personal interactions, and an intuitive pastoral ability to notice when something was even slightly off in a person's presentation, when their words did not quite match their affect, when the story they told had internal inconsistencies too subtle to consciously identify, but which registered as a vague dissonance. It was a skill he had developed over thousands of hours of pastoral counseling, learning to read people, to hear what they were not saying, to notice the small signals that indicated deeper problems they were not ready to articulate. The breaking point, the moment when accumulated unease crystallized into actual suspicion, came on a cold February evening, with temperatures well below freezing. Mitchell was working late at his church office, hunched over his oak desk that was scarred with decades of use, surrounded by commentaries and concordances, his desk lamp creating a pool of warm light in the otherwise dark building, preparing Sunday's sermon on the parable of the prodigal son, trying to find a fresh angle on a story he had preached probably 15 times over his career when he heard the distinctive sound of footsteps echoing in the sanctuary, leather shoes on the wooden floor. Assuming it was someone from the congregation, perhaps someone needing to talk through a problem or seeking a quiet place to pray away from household chaos, he rose from his desk, stretched his stiff back, and walked through the doorway connecting his office to the main sanctuary, and found Peter Henderson standing alone in the center aisle about halfway between the entrance and the altar, not praying or sitting but examining the church's architectural details with an intense analytical attention that seemed oddly inappropriate for someone who had been attending services there regularly for nearly 5 years. He was studying the sightlines, the layout, the exits, the placement of windows, moving his eyes methodically across the space in a way that made Mitchell think of a building inspector, assessing structural soundness rather than a parishioner appreciating sacred space. The two men exchanged pleasantries in the echoing space, their voices sounding strange in the empty church. Henderson explained with his characteristic earnestness that he had been taking an evening walk to clear his head after a long day at the store, had noticed lights on in the church building, and thought he would stop in to pray for guidance regarding some decisions about his future that had been troubling him. The explanation was reasonable, even admirable, the kind of thing that would normally warm a pastor's heart, demonstrating that his parishioners saw the church as a refuge and sought spiritual connection. But something about the way Henderson's eyes had been methodically studying the building's layout rather than engaged in devotion, about the systematic nature of his observation before Mitchell's arrival, interrupted him, triggered an instinct in Mitchell's gut that he could not immediately name or articulate, a feeling that something was wrong in a way he could not consciously identify. That night, lying in bed while Eleanor slept peacefully beside him and wind rattled the bedroom window, unable to find rest despite his exhaustion, the Reverend found himself turning over every interaction he had ever had with Peter Henderson, pulling them up from memory and examining them with new attention. Each individual memory seemed innocuous and even positive in isolation, presenting Henderson as a model church member and community citizen, but together they formed a portrait of someone who was meticulously performing rather than authentically living their identity, like an actor who had memorized every line and blocking perfectly but occasionally missed the subtle emotional notes, the tiny authentic human imperfections that would make the performance completely convincing. Henderson was almost too consistent, too pleasant, too appropriate, never genuinely angry or petty or flawed in the ways that real people inevitably were. Mitchell's next thought filled him with immediate guilt and shame that made his stomach clench. He was probably imagining things, projecting paranoia onto an innocent man simply because of the pervasive Cold War hysteria that had gripped America throughout the 1950s and showed no signs of abating. The fear of communist infiltration had led to witch hunts that destroyed innocent lives and reputations. Senator Joseph McCarthy's investigations through the early 50s had ruined careers, broken families, and created an atmosphere of suspicion that poisoned communities based on nothing more substantial than rumor, innuendo, and guilt by association. Thousands of decent Americans had seen their lives destroyed because someone accused them of communist sympathies. The last thing Mitchell wanted was to become part of that shameful chapter in American history, to let unfounded suspicion poison his relationship with a congregation member, to contribute to the climate of fear and accusation. And yet, despite his best efforts to dismiss it, the unease persisted and actually grew stronger the more he tried to rationalize it away. In early March, after 2 weeks of internal struggle, Mitchell made a decision that felt almost like a betrayal of his most fundamental pastoral principles and obligations. He began quietly observing Peter Henderson with deliberate attention and analytical focus rather than pastoral care. Not following him around town like some amateur detective or invading his privacy by snooping through his apartment, nothing so dramatic or unethical, but simply paying careful, conscious attention during their normal interactions at church services, fellowship events, and random encounters around town, watching and listening with analytical rather than accepting attention. He noticed that Henderson never received personal mail at his apartment, claiming when asked that he maintained a post office box for security reasons after experiencing a burglary at a previous residence, though he never provided specific details about when or where this burglary had supposedly occurred. He noticed that Henderson rarely made or received telephone calls at the hardware store during business hours, and when he did, the conversations were invariably brief and businesslike, never the lengthy personal calls that other employees sometimes engaged in. He noticed that Henderson had now lived in Millbrook for nearly 5 years, supposedly having grown up in Chicago, but had never once mentioned wanting to visit his hometown or expressed any specific nostalgia for particular childhood locations that could be verified. No favorite pizza place, no neighborhood that shaped him, no mention of specific intersections or local landmarks, just vague generalities about a past that existed only in outline form without specific details. The Reverend faced a profound moral dilemma that kept him awake night after night. His instincts and training as a pastor told him to trust people, to give them the benefit of the doubt, to believe in redemption and second chances, to extend grace to human imperfection, to assume good intentions rather than seeking hidden evil, but something deeper, perhaps a responsibility not just to individuals, but to his congregation and the broader community, was telling him with growing insistence that this situation merited closer examination, that his pastoral obligation included protecting his flock from potential dangers, and that turning a blind eye to genuine warning signs because they were uncomfortable would be its own kind of moral failure. In April, after another sleepless night of anguished deliberation, Mitchell made a decision that would change everything for himself, his church, and Peter Henderson. During a regional church conference held at a large Methodist church in Indianapolis, ostensibly about missionary work and church growth strategies, he arranged a private meeting with an old friend from seminary days, David Carlson, who had started in ministry alongside Mitchell, but had left pastoral work 8 years earlier to take a position with what he vaguely described as the federal government. Over lunch at a downtown restaurant, far from anyone who might recognize either of them, speaking in low voices at a corner booth while other diners ignored them, Mitchell shared his observations about Peter Henderson, prefacing absolutely everything with careful acknowledgement that he might simply be swept up in Cold War paranoia, that he might be seeing shadows where there was nothing, that he felt tremendous guilt even raising these concerns about a man who had done nothing objectively wrong. Carlson, who had gained weight and lost hair in the years since seminary, listened without interrupting, his expression growing progressively more serious as Mitchell laid out each small anomaly. When Mitchell finished, feeling foolish and ashamed for even articulating such nebulous suspicions, Carlson was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his untouched sandwich, before finally asking a series of very specific, detailed questions about Henderson's behavior, habits, daily routines, relationships, the nature of his work, his living situation, his financial circumstances as far as Mitchell could observe, questions that suggested this was not the first time Carlson had heard concerns like this. Finally, he pulled out a small black notebook, wrote down a phone number with careful precision, tore out the page and slid it across the table. "Tom," Carlson said, his voice low and urgent, his eyes serious in a way Mitchell had never seen during their seminary days of theological debates and late-night coffee. "I need you to call this number as soon as you get home today, not tomorrow, today. Ask specifically for Agent Robert Marsh. Tell him I referred you, use my full name, and tell him everything you just told me, every detail no matter how small. This is genuinely important, possibly very important. The FBI has been tracking patterns of possible Soviet infiltration in small Midwestern towns for several years now based on defector information. Your observations, the specific details you noticed, match profiles they have been developing of what they call illegal operatives." Mitchell felt his stomach drop sickeningly and his hands begin to tremble. The abstract concern that he had been able to half dismiss as paranoia had suddenly become terrifyingly concrete. "Are you seriously saying Peter Henderson might actually be a Soviet agent?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, barely able to believe he was speaking such words out loud, in the context of his own peaceful town and congregation. "I am saying the FBI will definitely want to investigate thoroughly," Carlson replied with careful precision, choosing his words deliberately. "And if Henderson is what you suspect, if your pastoral instincts are correct about this, you may have stumbled onto something very significant for national security. But Tom, listen to me carefully because this is extremely important. You need to be extraordinarily careful from this moment forward. If this man is a trained intelligence operative, he has been taught to detect surveillance and suspicion. Any indication whatsoever that you are suspicious, any change in your behavior toward him, could put you and your family at serious risk or cause him to disappear, and we would lose the opportunity to understand his network. Promise me you will not do anything except make that phone call. Let the professionals handle this investigation. Your job is simply to continue exactly as you have been." The drive back to Millbrook felt endless, every mile stretched by anxiety. Mitchell's mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, each more unsettling than the last. He thought about his wife Eleanor and their 3 children, and what risks he might be exposing them to. He thought about Grace Community Church, about the sacred trust his congregation placed in him, about what it would mean if he was right, and they had been harboring a Soviet spy among them for 5 years. He thought about Peter Henderson, about the countless conversations they had shared, and what it would mean if every single moment had been a carefully constructed performance, if this quiet, polite man was actually living a complete fabrication in service of a foreign power dedicated to America's destruction. That evening, long after Eleanor and the children were asleep, after midnight when the house was utterly silent, except for the ticking of the hallway clock, Mitchell walked through the cold darkness to his church office, closed the door, turned on only his desk lamp, and made the phone call that would set everything else in motion. Agent Robert Marsh answered on the second ring with crisp professionalism, listened to Mitchell's stumbling explanation of who he was and how David Carlson had referred him, and then asked the Reverend to meet him in person the following Tuesday at a specific address in Fort Wayne, about an hour's drive north of Millbrook, an address that Mitchell should not write down but memorize. The meeting took place in a nondescript government office building, institutional and anonymous. Agent Robert Marsh was a lean man in his mid-40s, with sharp, penetrating eyes and an economy of movement that suggested military training and discipline. He wore a plain dark suit and narrow tie, looking exactly like what Mitchell had always imagined FBI agents looked like. He was accompanied by a younger agent named Peters, who appeared to be in his late 20s, who took extensive notes in rapid shorthand, while Marsh asked Mitchell to recount every single detail he could remember about Peter Henderson, every observation, every interaction, every tiny inconsistency, no matter how insignificant or foolish it might seem. The interview lasted 3.5 hours. Marsh's questions were extraordinarily precise and probing, clearly designed by someone with extensive training to separate genuine observations from speculation, fact from interpretation, actual evidence from paranoid imagination. He asked about Henderson's friendships, who he spent time with, whether those relationships seemed genuine or performative. He asked about routines, what time Henderson arrived at church, where he sat, whether that changed, what he did during fellowship time. He asked about Henderson's reactions to current events. Had he ever expressed political opinions? Did he discuss the news? How did he respond when others talked about the Soviet threat or international tensions? He asked about Henderson's work, how he interacted with customers, whether he handled money responsibly, if anyone had ever complained. He asked about the church community itself with surprising detail. Who were the prominent members? Did anyone hold security clearances for government or defense work? Who had served in the military? Were there any members who worked in sensitive positions? Whether Millbrook was near any military or industrial facilities that might be of intelligence interest to a foreign power? As the questions continued relentlessly, Mitchell realized with growing anxiety the full scope of what he had stumbled into. The FBI had clearly been tracking Soviet illegal operatives for years, probably since the early 1950s, trying to map their networks and understand their objectives, methodically building files and profiles. Marsh explained, speaking in carefully measured terms that revealed information without providing classified details, that the Soviets had successfully infiltrated potentially hundreds of deep-cover agents into American communities over the past 2 decades, many of them placed in locations exactly like Millbrook, precisely because such towns seemed completely beyond suspicion, too small and insignificant to warrant Soviet attention, which was exactly why they were perfect for establishing sleeper networks that could be activated if needed. Reverend Mitchell, Marsh said as the interview finally concluded and he turned off the recording device that had been running throughout, "We are going to investigate Mr. Henderson thoroughly and carefully, but this will take considerable time, months, possibly longer. We need to build a complete picture of his activities, contacts, and mission without alerting him in any way. That means your life needs to continue exactly as it has been, without the slightest variation. You attend church with him every Sunday. You make conversation when you see him at the hardware store or around town. You treat him exactly as you always have. You give him absolutely no reason whatsoever to think that anyone suspects anything unusual. Can you do that?" Mitchell nodded slowly, though his mind was reeling with the overwhelming implications. "What happens if you confirm that he is actually a Soviet agent?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Then we will have some difficult decisions to make," Marsh replied with deliberate vagueness. "Sometimes we watch and monitor, rather than arrest immediately, because these operatives can lead us to others in their network, to handlers and controllers, to understanding Soviet intelligence methods. But I want to be completely clear with you, Reverend. If Henderson is what we think he might be, he has received years of sophisticated training to detect surveillance and investigation, and he has contingency plans to disappear quickly if he feels threatened. The slightest indication that he is under any suspicion, the smallest change in how people interact with him, could cause him to activate those plans and vanish, and we would lose the opportunity to understand the full scope of his mission and connections. That is why your role, continuing to interact with him normally, is absolutely critical. You are now part of this investigation whether you want it to be or not." The burden of maintaining complete normalcy while harboring such profound suspicions proved almost unbearably excruciating for Mitchell over the following months. The next Sunday, standing in his familiar pulpit, delivering a sermon about faith and trust, core themes of his ministry, he looked out at Peter Henderson, sitting in his usual spot in the third pew from the back on the right side, taking notes in a small leather journal, as he often did, appearing to be a model of engaged worship, and Mitchell felt like a complete fraud, a hypocrite preaching trust while actively investigating someone. After the service, when Henderson approached to compliment the message, saying it had given him much to think about, Mitchell had to force himself to smile naturally and accept the praise with genuine warmth, all while wondering what calculations and assessments were happening behind the other man's eyes, whether Henderson could detect any change in Mitchell's manner, whether years of KGB training gave him the ability to sense suspicion. The FBI investigation, conducted with meticulous care and patience that seemed agonizingly slow to Mitchell, gradually began to reveal layers of deception that exceeded even his most anxious suspicions. Agents discovered through postal inspection that Henderson's supposed post office box in Millbrook was actually registered to a false address that did not exist. Surveillance teams, positioned in carefully selected locations and rotated frequently to avoid detection, documented his occasional trips to nearby cities where he made brief stops that seemed to have no legitimate purpose, parking at a specific location for exactly 12 minutes, then leaving, walking through a park and sitting on a particular bench for 7 minutes, entering a library but checking out no books. Handwriting analysis performed by forensic experts examining business documents Henderson had signed at the hardware store revealed subtle characteristics inconsistent with someone educated in American schools, certain letter formations and connections that suggested learning to write in a different language first. Most damning, financial investigators working with banks discovered that small amounts of money periodically appeared in Henderson's account from untraceable sources, deposited in ways specifically designed to avoid detection and reporting requirements, amounts ranging from $100 to $500, appearing quarterly with no clear source. But the FBI faced a significant tactical challenge. They needed concrete proof that would stand up in federal court, evidence that demonstrated actual espionage rather than just suspicious behavior, and they needed to understand Henderson's network and mission before moving against him. Simply being suspicious was not sufficient for prosecution. Simply being Russian was not a crime. They needed to catch him in an actual act of espionage or communication with Soviet handlers, evidence that could not be explained away. Summer arrived with its familiar rhythms, and with it came the church's annual picnic held at Millbrook Lake on the 4th of July weekend, a tradition dating back to the church's founding. Mitchell watched Henderson participate in the three-legged race paired with elderly Frank from the hardware store, help carry tables from trucks and set them up under shade trees, laugh at jokes during the watermelon eating contest with apparent genuine enjoyment, and wondered at the extraordinary depth of commitment and discipline required to maintain such a complete performance year after year after year. How did someone live entirely inside a fabricated identity without it consuming them or driving them to madness? What did Peter Henderson think about when he was alone at night in his apartment? Did any part of him regret the path he had chosen, experience guilt about the deception, or was he so thoroughly indoctrinated in communist ideology that he felt only pride and satisfaction in his service to the Soviet Union? The breakthrough that the FBI had been patiently waiting for came in September, when surveillance teams rotating on 24-hour schedules documented Henderson making a strange trip late one evening. At 11:43 on a Thursday night, when most of Millbrook was asleep, he drove his aging Ford sedan to a rest area along a rural highway 30 miles from town, an isolated location with minimal traffic at that hour, parked in a specific spot furthest from the bathroom facilities, walked with apparent casual aimlessness to a particular trash receptacle, deposited what appeared to be a folded newspaper, lit a cigarette and smoked it while looking at the stars, then returned to his car and drove back to Millbrook. 2 hours and 17 minutes later, a different vehicle with out-of-state plates arrived, and an individual retrieved the newspaper from the trash can before driving away without stopping. The FBI followed the courier to Indianapolis, where he disappeared into the Soviet consulate. On the next scheduled drop 2 weeks later, FBI agents intercepted the newspaper before the pickup could occur, carefully opening it in a laboratory setting, and found that it contained microfilm carefully hidden in the fold. Microfilm that, when developed, revealed detailed layouts of a defense contractor facility located 70 miles away that manufactured guidance systems for military missiles, including the names and personal information of employees who might be vulnerable to blackmail or ideological recruitment, those with gambling debts, affairs, financial problems, or other exploitable weaknesses. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The game was definitively over. On a Thursday evening in October 1959, nearly 2 years after Reverend Mitchell's first vague suspicions had begun, FBI agents arrested Peter Henderson as he was closing the hardware store for the night, locking the front door. They found hidden in his apartment, secreted in various cleverly designed hiding places, a sophisticated shortwave radio concealed in a hollowed-out book, one-time cipher pads for encoding messages, additional unexposed microfilm, $4,000 in cash bundled in small bills, and a false passport with a different identity and photograph showing him with a beard. Under intensive interrogation that lasted 11 hours, faced with absolutely overwhelming physical evidence, Henderson eventually admitted his true identity. Lieutenant Colonel Pyotr Volkov of the KGB, who had been operating in deep cover under false identity for 6 years. The arrest sent profound shockwaves through Millbrook that took months to settle. Neighbors who had known Henderson for years, who had purchased hammers and paint from him, who had sat beside him at church, could not believe that this quiet, helpful, thoroughly ordinary man was actually a Soviet spy, a trained intelligence officer serving a foreign power. Many residents initially thought it must be a terrible mistake, some kind of government overreach or paranoid reaction, refused to believe the evidence. When that evidence became public during the federal trial the following spring, documented in detail through testimony and exhibits, when Henderson was convicted on 17 counts of espionage and received a 30-year prison sentence, the community struggled profoundly to process what had happened in their midst, how they could have been so thoroughly deceived. For Reverend Mitchell, the experience was profoundly and permanently transforming in ways that took years to fully understand. The trial brought intensely unwanted attention that he had never sought, with reporters from major newspapers and even television crews descending on Millbrook wanting to interview the pastor who had exposed a Soviet operative, requesting that he appear on news programs and write articles. Mitchell declined nearly all requests, deeply uncomfortable with anything that felt like self-promotion, sensationalism, or exploitation of serious matters for personal gain. He had not acted out of any desire for recognition or reward, but simply from a troubled conscience and a sense of responsibility to his congregation. The case had broader implications that extended far beyond Millbrook. Henderson's arrest and the intelligence gathered from his operation helped the FBI identify other potential illegal operatives and understand more about Soviet methods, tactics, and priorities. It revealed fundamental vulnerabilities in how thoroughly someone with sufficient training and preparation could embed themselves in American society, passing undetected for years. It led to enhanced counterintelligence procedures and increased scrutiny of certain patterns. But the experience also carried a painful personal cost for Mitchell that lasted for years. Some members of his congregation, though a minority, felt strongly that he had betrayed fundamental pastoral principles by reporting Henderson to authorities. They argued that a minister's primary duty was to offer redemption and second chances to sinners, not to serve as an informant for government authorities, that he should have confronted Henderson directly and given him opportunity to confess and repent. The church board held several difficult meetings to discuss Mitchell's actions, ultimately supporting him, but with some vocal dissent that created lasting division. Mitchell himself wrestled constantly with the ethics of what he had done. Had he violated a sacred trust by investigating a member of his congregation? Where precisely was the line between pastoral care and civic duty? Could he have handled it differently? In the quiet hours of night, he replayed every decision and continued to question whether he had done the right thing in the right way. His wife Eleanor provided crucial support during this extended period of self-examination. "Tom," she said one evening as they sat together on their porch watching the sunset, "you did not seek this out. You noticed something wrong, and when you could not dismiss it, you acted responsibly. That man was not actually part of your congregation. He was using the church, using all of us, as cover for activities that could have harmed people. You protected your flock in the way that mattered most." Eventually, Mitchell found peace, imperfect but sufficient, in the conviction that sometimes loving people requires difficult actions that feel contradictory to simpler notions of grace. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.